name's Ben Allen. Today, I have the opportunity to be interviewing John Jordan with Expense Reduction Analysts. Hey, John.
Hey, Ben, how are you?
Great. So I met John about probably 8 months ago at the Blackbird Public House. We had a networking event that, Linda Montgomery, John Geis, Noah Madison put together. And what struck me initially is that John is very well connected in the manufacturing field. He's been working in that for a number of years. And I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for John to educate us more about supply chain and a little bit about what Expense Reduction Analyst does, but more specifically for us to learn about what he does and how he can share some of his knowledge with all of us and make us more aware of what's going on in the supply chain, partially with COVID. So, John, I would like to just start off with, when we talk about the supply chain, can you educate me a little more on what supply chain looks like with these manufacturing companies?
You bet, Ben. So the manufacturers, they're typically going to have their top spends in the areas that you'd expect. It's going to be raw materials that are, all the top items that they're using to assemble whatever it is they're building. And then the necessary logistics, transportation to get it in to assemble and then back out to customers. And that's, we find their top 5 suppliers are typically going to be in those areas: raw materials, core buying, logistics. And then beyond that, it'll go into some expected areas, which can include things that are not commonly thought of as supply chain banking, health and benefits, commercial insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll find that a small percentage of the spend is being chased by a big multiple of suppliers. So there's a concentration for 60, 70% of the total spend, and then maybe 20 or 30%, a very large number of suppliers involved in that area. And that's often a good area, by the way, to find savings.
So let's back into that you just mentioned. Would you start us off a little bit with this idea of when you see a regular and average $500 million manufacturing company, before your knowledge comes into play, tell me a little bit about what that supply chain typically looks like.
Yeah, and from a management perspective, Ben, so how they're managing all the spending, is that part of it?
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, and what we find, so a larger middle market manufacturer, I should say, really kind of in the middle of the field, $100 million, maybe even starting at the $75 million mark, you're going to find a developed procurement team. So it will no longer be departmental purchasing, as you'll find with the smaller company. And within that procurement team, you're going to find some very professional people, I should say, that have a background in manufacturing is, the norm. They're typically going to have buyer expertise and the core buying that I'd mentioned earlier. And then they'll have some good professionals that are working using generalist tools for when you get into many, dozens of other areas of purchasing. Because it's not economic to have, specialists for all these different areas.
Got it. So that's, again, an average manufacturing company that you're talking about. Do you mind sharing some of your professional wisdom in regards to what kind of things do you like to do with a company that you just described to help them be a more mature company in regards to their supply chain?
Yeah, so, it really is the starting point, and we are typically working with companies that are doing a good job with procurement. So they're using best practices as far as having good management of their data, which is always an important piece, of course. And we're always hopeful, at the very least, that there's good management at a dashboard level so they can monitor uh, exactly what's going on in the various areas they're buying in. So as an example, in dashboard worlds, and we're always looking for relevant dashboards or data, we recommend that for ongoing best practices that they're managing really in just about anywhere in the supply chain, that you're monitoring how much contract buying you're doing as opposed to non-contract, and your contract buying is always going to be your most efficient buying. So that's an important discipline. Manage that, and have a trend analysis. How has it been? What has the trend been in the past? And looking to increase that over time. Because that is the example, as you start moving into more non-contract buying, invariably your costs will go up.
That's great advice. The kind of thing that I really like to hit on in interviews like this, where you're sharing good knowledge. Another one that we talked about before this meeting were the logistical maps, something that you don't see very much, but it's critical for managing a supply chain well. Can you talk to us a little more about those?
You bet. So it's interesting in the manufacturing world. It's not limited to manufacturing, by the way. It's in distribution as well. Is the companies grow organically through adding other locations, or they do it through acquisition. And as they add additional locations, either way, they're going to try and optimize that additional holding or facility, and then they'll go on and just keep building their logistical map. The piece that is often really helpful is to take a step back and say, okay, what is our total enterprise logistical scheme, if you will? And that's typically what we will do. And we just finished an engagement recently for about $120 million manufacturer, so kind of mid-sized manufacturer for this market, and looked at all the different things from starting with small package freight, which they were doing significant volumes of that, less than truckload, etc. And so then you can take a look once you have this all drawn and say, okay, here's what we're doing. To do that, you need to not only pull down the data of who the suppliers are and all of that, and you actually need to go to each of the plants or facilities and interview the manager and find out exactly what it is that they're doing. And you'll uncover things you just don't know in the finance department. So once you go through that exercise, our particular approach is we look at the top 10 lanes, if you will. And so a lane could be, a barge run like with this client, but more commonly it's point A to point B with less than truckload shipments and truckload. When we ran that, the top 10 lanes, we found that 65% of their spend was just on those lanes of all their logistics. And the client was quite surprised because of all the locations. They were really interested that there was such a high concentration. So in any event, once you look at it that way, then typically a light bulb goes off on, okay, so these 10 lanes, are we using the optimal suppliers, shippers, for our LTL as an example from Denver to Los Angeles? And once you start looking at that, then savings are going to be in your future almost certainly. The results of that particular project, this client knew they had an issue because they're PE backed and the PE group had other comparisons. And management had taken a run at it, saved single digits. When we went back with the effort that I just mentioned, we were able to achieve just over 26% savings, and it was about 530 million, I beg your pardon, 530,000 in savings on that one logistics project. So there are dollars to be had, looking at it differently and understanding where you're spending your dollars.
That is a great story. I can't remember the last time someone told me that they were able to save a company $500,000 on just looking at things from a different perspective. So that's really cool that that particular technique that you're using. I think the biggest question I really want to fall on here at the end of our conversation is to talk about the disruption that we've all seen as a result of the COVID crisis that's hit us. We are now in August of COVID, and I'm curious if you could share some sage wisdom around what has happened to the supply chain for a lot of the manufacturing companies. What have they learned? What are they doing new? What can you share with us about that?
Yeah, that's such a relevant question. Top of mind, of course, with the manufacturers and others. So, the number one thing that we recommend is to look at your, certainly your key suppliers. And we're doing that as part of our regular practice for a cost reduction perspective. But certainly to look at it to see if you have an over dependency on key suppliers, particularly with your raw materials. And so, I think we all know that having a single supplier for a key item, maybe metals as an example, could lead to, real disruption, which all cost reduction goes out the window if you run out of any of the materials for a manufacturer, of course. So it depends on the area. So doing an analysis, you may find an area where you should have 3 or 4 suppliers supplying the same thing. Is a good exercise at this time with COVID. You may find your costs go up a bit as you don't have as much of concentration and therefore volume buying, but it's well worth the monies to make sure that you continue to operate. So that would be our number one area to recommend to take a look at.
John, this was everything I would hope it to be, a really educational experience from your point of view. Is there anything that you would like to share with us at the end here?
Yeah, I would say if you choose to work with companies on the outside to help with your expenses, and I'm not suggesting that it's really an independent company's decision what makes most sense for them. But if you do, probably the top things I would recommend is be sure you work with a company that is only paid by you, the manufacturer, to eliminate any conflict of interest with dollars being paid, and that they're just, they're focused on your specific needs, and because at the end of the day, you're the client. The suppliers you work with are important, but they really need to have your best interest at heart, and that's how you can really create highest quality within your supply chain, and over time, do what we call bending the cost curve.
That's great. I'd like to give you just a little more time to give a little background about expense reduction analysts. You kind of hit on it there. What else do you want to share about your company and what you do?
You bet. Thanks, Ben. And I'll keep it brief. In the U.S. group, we have about 200 folks with ERA. They're mostly our subject matter experts in the roughly 43 areas that we work within. So separate practice groups, and with having a broad array of areas, a company does have the ability to actually move the needle for the total enterprise if that's what's desired.
John, thanks so much for your time today. This was an enjoyable interview for me, and just really appreciate your expertise.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate it.
Great.